Miller's Falls 417. I thought I'd make this video, kind of go through what it is, how it works, how it's constructed, maybe just put out a call to say, hey, if anybody's got any information about it, I would love to hear more. So let's get into it. I don't know a ton about Miller's Falls, so I'm just going to throw that out there as a disclaimer. I just happen to have this lathe and another one. So with that behind us, we got to go back a couple of decades, actually, kind of get to the beginning of it. So Miller's Falls, they were around for longer than that, but in 1873, they started making and selling handheld bracket saws. And if you're not familiar with a bracket saw is, me neither, so I had to look that up. Apparently, it's basically like a modern day coping or fret saw, handheld saw, but it's a wooden frame and it's got a pretty deep throat on it. I'll leave links in the description for the sources and places that I've been able to find information on this, because like I said, I haven't found a ton. 1874 and 1875, they sold upwards of 50,000 of these things, which I guess significantly outpaced what they were expecting. That sort of springboarded them into the idea that there might be something behind making a treadle-powered saw. And if you look at early treadle saws, they really do go along those same lines. And I'm not going to dive too far into the treadle saws, but it just kind of wanted to say, like, that's sort of what started all of this. Was in the 1870s, they just kind of found this market and decided to run with it. Over the years in the late 1800s, they became pretty well known for their scroll saws. I mean, if you've heard of the New Rogers scroll saws, those seem to be pretty popular now. Next to the Barnes Velocipedes, they seem to be some of the most sought after scroll saws out there. That happened shortly before they started doing more of the treadle lathes. 1885, Miller's Falls came out with two different smaller sized lathes. One was the Goodell, was a little bit heavier, a little bit nicer. It could do up to 15.5 inches in length, and it had a scroll saw attachment and came with a couple of turning tools, a short rest, tool rest, and a long tool rest. It was similarly priced to an existing machine that they had, which was the Lester saw, which was a better scroll saw than the attachment for the Goodell lathe, but it had an attachment for a lathe, the Lester saw did, but it could only turn up to 9 inches in length between centers. The Goodell could do up to 15.5, and then it also had the scroll saw, so it was largely marketed as something that would allow you to, I guess I would say, more hobbyist-oriented things. But at the same time, they also had this, which was the companion lathe. Technically, this was marketed towards hobbyists. It not very tall, and it was not quite finished as nicely as the Goodell lathe was, but it was a little bit cheaper, and it saw a couple of differences. One of them being it can actually do 16 inches in length between centers. Fewer tools, but it still had the option of the scroll saw attachment and all that. Professional woodworkers, here, I'll stand up and I'll show you what I mean. It's like thigh high. I've turned on it a handful of times. It's rough. I mean, unless you're sitting in a chair. Yeah, and even then, this flywheel isn't particularly massive, which is why I ended up putting a cast iron hand wheel on mine instead of the grindstone that they would have had on it from the factory. It's not up to the task of heavy-duty turning. But the upside is, my son loves it, so there's that. Enter 1915, and we get this, which is the 417. And this was a stark departure from the companion lathe and the Goodell lathe, where this thing obviously is quite a bit bigger, and it can accommodate up to 40 inches between centers, and it weighs 175-ish pounds, I believe. It was a lot more heavy duty. I mean, this flywheel actually has got some pretty good weight to it, and it works pretty well. It didn't come with like the scroll saw or the grinding wheel or a drill point. And so this didn't come with any of that. It didn't come with turning tools or anything. It just basically the lathe and the tool rests. This lathe was technically marketed as being able to do woodworking as well as light metal, but having used it for just wood, I would be surprised if anybody really used this thing for metal more than once. I have a feeling they would have tried it once and gone, yeah, no. This thing was introduced specifically for workshops where power wasn't really an option. In shops where maybe it was a small shop or maybe it was a little bit more rural and they didn't have either electricity to power machines or the means to power something with line shaft, they were still making these types of tools even into the 20s. It enabled craftsmen without the means of the larger production shops to still be able to turn things fairly effectively. I think it's a pretty interesting lathe, and again, I haven't been able to find a whole lot of information about it, so if you have more information, please let me know. The OldToolHeaven, he's got a lot of really good information, and that's basically where I've done, I'd say, 75% of my knowledge gathering. So huge shout out to him, and I'll again put a link of his down in the description just to kind of get some more of that context. But I think the next thing I want to do is get done with the history part of it, and let's take a look at how this thing actually works. This lathe is not 100% original, so I will try to point out the things that I've modified or that I don't believe are original. And let's start out with this. I put a thrust bearing in between the pulley and the headstock here, as well as between this piece and the headstock casting as well. That is just because as things are pushing in that way, I just wanted to have something in here so that it wasn't just metal on metal. I have replaced the bolts because most of mine were wrong. So what I ended up doing is buying a bunch of square head bolts and going a little bit overboard in making sure that I try to keep this thing looking as original as possible. Did end up drilling and putting in a set screw just to hold it there because I use it for some other stuff. But this would have been the original drive spur, so this 2-prong spur. And then that is actually a 2-piece thing. So that threads onto the spindle here, which is a not terrible but sort of goofy 3/4 inch diameter, but 12 teeth per inch. That I was actually able to find a tap for, made my own, and then actually ended up having a friend make the better version of an adapter for a chuck, but we'll get into that later. This is one of the centers, not a live center. It's just tapered. This is original, but one thing that I found, that is actually a #1 taper. What I did is go to the Jungle website and bought these. It's a set actually, but it's all Morse 1 taper, and so that fits in there. The only thing is it's quite a bit longer than what this does, so you lose a bit of that 40-inch capacity between centers if you use something like that. I find this a little bit nicer because it's the steb center, so this goes in, but also with the teeth there, you don't need to get quite as big of a bite as this. The other part that I was alluding to earlier is this is a Nova G3 threaded insert version of their chuck. I don't think it was actually a blank adapter. I think the one that I sent Kenny was a 5/8 inch plain shaft, and he was able to drill that out and then tap it for the 1/4 or the 3/4 12. This threads on just like any other chuck would, and then it goes right up against that, and that specifically is why I wanted to have this threaded. So I have that set screw and then threaded that so that way I can stop that to jam this up against it, and then I don't over tighten it or anything like that. Now I'm able to have a proper chuck on my Treadle Lathe, which is pretty sweet. That increased the usability by quite a bit for me, so that was a huge win. Coming down to the other side, so this is the same exact center as on the headstock side. Again, that's a #1 Morse taper, so I can get like this live center that I got along with that drive center. And I also got a Jacob's chuck to Morse taper 1 adapter so that I could have a drill chuck on the end on here. If I wanted to drill, I could do that, or I can also stick it in the chuck side and have it on the drive side. If I wanted to use this for making bottle opener handles or something like that that have a little mandrel, I could use that in here and flip it over there and do the turning I want. But that is pretty sweet. This screw I've got loosened off so that I can adjust it pretty easily, and then if I need to tighten it down when I'm actually turning, I can do that, but I need a wrench for that. As far as I can tell, this faucet style handle is original to this lathe. The catalog drawings look to match this exact handle, so I would be very surprised if this wasn't the original, because it's got sort of a flange on the bottom that clamps it up against the bottom of the lathe bed. So I'm pretty sure that's original, and the banjo would have had something very similar. That is something that is 100% not original. It did not have one when I bought it, so I ended up getting this one. I don't remember what it came off of, but it was just on eBay. It was pretty cheap. And then this is actually from my jet lathe, and it's just a 12-inch tool rest with a 5/8-inch post. So this I'm okay with. Not having to loosen up a handle like this to move around the banjo, that's a sacrifice that I'm willing to make. And truthfully, even if I had the original tool rest, I'd probably would have done this anyway, just because it's a much nicer way to do things. The cast iron legs are just held in place with one bolt at the top. So this is like a low profile bolt, which I did source. This is a new one, and it's just the one thing that holds it together. So it's surprisingly rigid for something that's literally held together with two bolts, at least as far as this end and that end is concerned. Now, taking a look at the drive mechanism, so we can see these two belt pulleys here. These are intended for flat belts. I'm assuming that these would have been for a leather belt back in the day, but they take a 1-inch belt and they do have a slight crown on them so that it'll track in the center. And there's the larger one and the smaller one. That belt then comes down to the bottom where we have this pretty large flywheel that also has the two steps here, and they are both crowned as well. When I got this lathe, it already had this belt on it, and it is a, I don't know who made it, but 6K882, and it is like the perfect size for this because it's not too tight, but also still tight enough that it gets the job done. And then over here is a pitman arm, so there's just this little arm here that sticks out as an offset, and that is fixed to the shaft, and the flywheel is also fixed to that shaft. There's a bolt over here. There's this bolt, which is like a shoulder stepped screw. So there's the part that goes through here is smaller and then threads into this. And then there's also a shoulder that then all of this would ride on. This is a new piece that my friend made off of the original because the threads were so messed up that it wasn't going to work. But I added some bronze bushings just to cut down on some of the wear, and then made a new pitman arm. This is out of birch. I don't know if it was original or not. It would have almost surprised me to be original because it's a round-headed thing, but either way, that was with it when I got it, and I did the same thing. I added bronze bushings down here, but now you can see this arm goes down to this square shaft, which has this pedal on it, which is what you use to power it. As you run it, this goes up and down, and it rotates that square shaft on the other side there, and that runs the arm, which then runs the pitman arm, that then goes and moves this crank, which spins our flywheel, which runs the belt, which spins the pulley up here, which spins the chuck, which spins the work. Which seems pretty obvious when you look at it that way. The thing that I really liked about this lathe versus the companion lathe is you loosen this up and you can move this treadle foot power mechanism up and down that square shaft, which is pretty nice. So you're not just stuck having it all the way down here. So if you're turning something on the tailstock side, you can move this over so that you're actually pumping over by where you're going to be turning, so you don't have to try and, you know, run the treadle mechanism way over here while you're turning over here. Or I've got a son, so I can put this thing all the way over here on this end, and I can be turning over here, and he can be running the treadle for me. Maybe. Maybe not. We'll see. It's still a little bit too big for him. The sweep up and down is a bit much for a 4-year-old, but it's pretty cool that you can slide that back and forth, and I really do like that because, like I said, it allows you to move it based on where you need to be when you're turning. This is the end of that square shaft, and there's just a hole in it, and so I've got these two pretty thick washers just to take up any slack, on one on the inside, one on the outside, and then I've put oil in between them just to try to cut down on wear. But there's just a cotter pin in the end. I don't know if that would have been a straight pin, a cotter pin, or whatever, but that's what came in it for me, so that's what I stuck back in it. So that part is pretty straightforward and pretty simple. That's pretty much all there is to the lathe itself. Thanks for watching. I appreciate it. If anybody's got more information on this, I would be appreciative, because it's a pretty interesting lathe, and I've only been able to find, I think, OldToolHeaven. Randy over there's got just a crap ton of information about anything that has to do with Miller's Falls. Found a couple of catalogs that reference this 417, but that's about it. So if anybody has anything interesting, any advertisings, any pictures of them, or knows of any other lathes, I honestly can say I've not really seen any other 417s around. It seems to be pretty uncommon, and if they are more common than I thought, people don't share them. So I'd be interested if anybody's got any sources, or if they know of another one, or if they've seen another one, if they have pictures of another one, if you own another one, I'd love to hear about it. But anyway, I will catch you in the next one.